Okay, so today we're going to talk a little bit about iteration, but not iteration as we're typically talking about. We're going to talk about iterations, the product feature, which are time boxes that you can assign your issues to. And like a lot of times, you might think of these as sprints. That's typically how most customers use them. And talk a little bit about how we've looked at adding metrics to kind of enhance how you'd manage this and how that's evolved over time. So in the docs, we describe iterations as being a way to track issues over a period of time that allow you to track velocity and volatility metrics. Now, the funny thing is you can't actually do that in the product today, which is a bummer. So I've talked to a number of customers and they described their fairly horrible workflows of exporting this to Excel, creating like Excel templates where they're like managing their velocity and calculating that, and then coming back into GitLab. That's a pretty painful thing to have to do every 2 weeks or however often your sprints end. So it kind of makes sense to look at this as part of how could we actually make this something that's part of this, make it so you're not jumping into Excel every time you want to figure out how many points should I assign next time. Um, and when we talk about velocity and volatility, like, what does this actually mean? There's too many words here, but in short, velocity is a way to look at, based on the past however many iterations, what should you expect to complete? And this is generally working on like weight or story points or, whatever the team calls it. But let's say over the last 5 iterations, you've typically, on average, completed, 32 points. Teams can then use that as a sort of upper bound for how many points they should plan for the next iteration. That, generally, if you complete 32, you should be able to complete like 30 or maybe 32 as a goal. And then what volatility tells you is how far your iterations tend to jump in terms of how many points were completed. So if you have high volatility, that would mean that one iteration you completed 16, and then the next one 48. And it kind of tends, you take these kind of in tandem, that high volatility makes your velocity less reliable. So you might see that 32 points as your velocity, but if you have high volatility, it also tells you can't really rely that heavily on that to know what your next iteration is going to look like. You generally want to strive towards low volatility. So having high volatility also just tells you, like, maybe I need to look at the team and kind of understand why is it fluctuating this much. Some fluctuations always going to be the case, but you want to keep it kind of manageable. So that could mean you're planning, you're not really doing a good job weighting your issues, and you're underweighting them where you don't complete as much as you think, or you're just weighting them inconsistently. So that's kind of what we started with. Was we know what people are doing. We know they're calculating these things. These are like super basic agile concepts that anyone that's doing agile planning, at least velocity, is familiar with. How can we make that work a little bit better? But what we kind of started to realize is, what do I do with that information? Like, okay, so we can put velocity in there. It's just a number. It's not that hard to put on the page, but what does it enable you to do, and why are people using it? And what they're trying to do is plan their next sprint, or the next 3 sprints, or whatever they're kind of lining up. And this is a way to kind of see, like, okay, should I add another story? Do I have too many? Do I need to move some to the next one? How do my next 3 all kind of line up? And they're trying to see these things using boards. And a lot of times, what we'll hear is I open the board that I've configured with iterations on one window, and then I have another window open with my iteration report, and I'm like refreshing the page as I move things. It's just a very sort of like disjointed way to go about this, because right now we have a report, and that report's just a report, and then we have the board where you can manage. And these things are not really connected, so we can add velocity to the report, but to actually use that in a meaningful way, you're going to do that somewhere else. So how can we kind of bring these two things a little bit closer together, and make the iterations process more of a combined experience, as opposed to a reporting experience separate from a management experience? So we kind of started just with like, how do we add velocity, kind of exploring some things there. And it kind of evolved a little bit more into this, how do we manage iterations? Because that's really the purpose of having these metrics, is to make it easier to manage intelligently. And so just again, so a little bit of context, like this is what people are kind of setting up today, is like they'll set up a board. They might set up a board for a single iteration. So this is how you're this is more like tracking something in flight. So I have a board scoped to a single iteration or the current iteration for a cadence. And then I'll probably set up like workflow labels so I can see, and this will tell me, okay, how many points are in this. Although I'd kind of have to count all of the weights across these, but you can kind of see what's there. And then what we also see is creating boards for iteration planning. And this is actually a board that someone created in GitLab to do just this, where you have to create a list for every iteration, and then you have to manage that every time to add new iterations. It's really a fairly cumbersome process today, but it is what most customers that are using iterations do. Is they build something kind of like this, and this is sort of where they're looking to see, like, okay, I've got 21 weight here, and if I've calculated my velocity somewhere else, I can kind of tell, okay, I've got some remaining, or that's really quite high compared to what I typically do. And then you might move things into a later iteration or something like that. But again, this is all in the board, whereas our iteration report is elsewhere in the product. So we started looking at like just, again, basically how can we bring velocity and volatility into the report? That's kind of where we have typically the analysis of your iterations and what's happening. And we kind of realized, first thing, we probably need like a cadence level report. So a cadence is sort of the container of your iterations. It allows multiple teams to use different sprints. You might have a team that uses a 3-week sprint and another one that uses a 2-week sprint, or where you don't want to mix the analytics between them. Today it has like a burn down chart in the iteration report, but we don't have a cadence report to sort of track things across iterations, which, since velocity is naturally across iterations, we'd want to be able to see. You'd kind of want to see like, how has that velocity changed over time, so you get a sense of kind of where you're at and how reliable that is. We'd want to pull it into the iteration report so you can actually see how much have you planned for that iteration against your velocity. In this case, you have maybe 2 points remaining. So if you have some nice small stories, maybe you'll pull those in. And then we could potentially bring that into the boards itself. So again, you're getting a little bit of that analytics at the point where you're actually doing that management. But I think this is sort of where we started to realize, like, this cadence report isn't something we have. It wasn't really something we were even thinking about initially, but it became a little bit more obvious that we'd probably need something like that to actually make this meaningful and make this useful. Being able to look at things like composition started to come into play as we were hearing people talk about how they use this and what they'd want to see. So it's both, what have I planned? Okay, I've got some points remaining, but do I want to spend it on bugs? Do I want to spend it on chores? Do I want to spend it in one project or the other? Being able to see kind of how that breaks down, just looking at other kind of metrics we could build in to do the things that people are already doing, but in a native sort of way. And then this is sort of where this went, where you can actually see, we've pulled the board concept into the report. So this is not just, burn up, burn down, but as I'm planning, I can kind of see, I can maybe move things around or track them here. So I'm not having to jump back and forth and do the split screen thing. I can kind of see my analytics and like the drivers for those analytics. Today it's just a table. You can't do anything with it. If you want to move it around or change the status of it or something, you have to leave the report to do that. So this is kind of trying to solve some of that while I'm managing a single iteration. Can I actually use this to see how are things going, and then keep track of things? And then at the cadence level, so this is completely net new, what are we doing over time? Like, what do my sprints typically look like? What have I planned versus completed? This is like, what a lot of our project managers are kind of looking to see is like, okay, are we planning? Are we doing a good job planning? if we're consistently off from what we plan and complete, our say-do metrics are not looking good. Like, how do we track that? How do we improve on that? It's a little hard to do in the product today, but this, would make it a little bit easier to actually see that, and then be able to kind of make some changes where you could see these are lists for your iterations, so you can kind of move things from one iteration to the next and actually see kind of how that might affect your flow of things over time. Um, this has been taken out to a number of customers. All of this right now is just kind of a concept that we are exploring as a way to get more feedback. So we've taken this out, talked to a number of customers. I think generally gotten good feedback, and some of the things that are here are kind of were added based on things that we've heard, like the composition, where it's kind of like, oh, I'm constantly doing these breakdowns and running these reports. What else could we kind of pull in here, and then really honing in on what was planned versus what was completed. That's another area people, when I've shown them this, they usually ask is like, how can I see what was planned? Meaning I put it in the iteration before the iteration started versus what was completed, because that's like the big pain point with all of this is I planned 20 and then we completed 20, but it might not have been the same 20. We left some things on the table because other things got added mid-flight. Like people are basically hacking this. Like one person said they use incidents literally just so they can look at this and see, oh, these two are incidents. That means we added it after the fact. It's a very like roundabout way to do that, using kind of the tools at hand, but something that it just makes sense as you're tracking sprints. You want to be able to understand what was sort of ad hoc, because that's generally not good practice from an agile perspective, but it is kind of a natural thing teams do. We also looked at, maybe there's an opportunity to flip the model rather than relying on the report, but like, could we bring some of this into the board so that people that want to just work in the board, could we have like a metrics panel or something like that, just to kind of see like, what that would look like. And I think, as we progress, we can kind of look to see, would we need one or both, or kind of where people would gravitate. It presents essentially the same functionality, but just in a different context. So like I said, like right now we've shown this to a number of people. It's kind of on pause for the moment as we work on other things. We were primarily working on this a few months ago, just trying to get kind of feedback and understand, what we might need to do this, because just adding the velocity is something we can do relatively simply, but actually managing that in a way that enables people to work better, I think is actually a bigger lift. It requires a little bit more rethinking of how we've approached iterations to make sure that people can use this. It's an interesting feature because we don't really, there's a few groups I've seen using it in GitLab, but by and large, I don't see iterations being used that commonly. But for our customers that are more in the agile, like Scrum or scaled agile space, iterations are a very common thing that they're using, so they can break things up into 2-week sprints or however their team kind of works. So we'll continue to iterate on this on iterations, refining things, getting more feedback. Like I said, right now it's kind of on pause, but we're still getting some feedback as we talk to customers that ask us questions about this. It's nice to kind of have, so we can pull up and kind of bring that up as they tend to ask us about how I could manage iterations. We can explain the current state and give them a peek at the future. One last thing I'll throw in here, I myself and some of the other folks on the plan team did a scaled agile training session a few months ago. Scaled agile is a huge framework for agile planning that a lot of large organizations are using or trying to adopt. It's pretty complex. There's a very convoluted diagram that you'll find if you Google this. One of the concepts on the diagram is PI planning in the program board. So one of the things we've been thinking about too is like, how can we enable teams to do PI, which is a programming increment planning, or run like a program board in GitLab. And this would be based on iterations. Like you can see, this is the diagram they provide specific to the program board, where they have iterations as columns, and then their swim lanes here are projects or teams or events. And we don't really have a way to do this right now. You could sort of do it if you used epics for this, kind of. You can't really visualize dependencies and things like that. So this is an interesting model to kind of look at and see, what are some teams using, and how could we try to recreate this. Basically, we would need some better swim lanes and dependencies, and then maybe some differences around how we connect things like iterations and milestones, which are a little bit different in this kind of environment from what we call milestones, but could possibly be used for the same purpose. It's interesting to read about. It's very complicated, but it is something a lot of people are trying to implement and figure out. I'll stop there. I know we've covered a lot of ground. Looks like Ben, you have the first question.
Yeah, just first off, nice work. This is exciting. But a sort of random thought occurred to me, if there's some kind of opportunity for AI or ML to kind of help you estimate the weights or recommend a distribution of things for your next iteration, or let you know kind of when you're over budget or things like that.
Yeah, it definitely could. And I don't know if I've talked to any teams that were using anything quite that sophisticated, but even sort of rudimentary, like I remember one person we talked to basically just had a matrix where if these things were true, like let's say it was a bug, it's automatically weight 1, but let's say it's a bug and it's mobile, then it's like weight 2. Like they've basically created this basic model of how they weight things that could easily be fed into an automation program of some sort, and then extended beyond that to try to learn sort of how things change as people move along. Yeah. Austin.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. So as I was watching you go through this presentation, the first thing that for me was value stream analytics. On that page, there's a key metric section, and like one of the things I see there is cycle time. Is there any like relationship for velocity to be a part of value stream analytics, or are they maybe not so coupled as I think they are?
I think they're definitely related, and I think the people that look at like flow metrics and value stream are probably the same audience for that are calculating their velocity and trying to figure that out. I think it's helpful to kind of understand, yeah, like how many points do we typically complete, and then where are the bottlenecks that that stop that from being higher. I do think it could be relevant for sure.
Christy.
Yeah. I'm gonna sound like a broken record because I think I bring this up every time we talk about plan. There are a lot of really obvious usability issues in plan. So we talked a lot about boards in this presentation. So, focus on boards a little bit. The process for creating a new board, finding a new board, the workflows for those things they definitely need improvement.
Yeah.
So how are we in product design coming with opinionation about improving these foundational things that already exist before adding new features and functionality on top of workflows that, in my opinion, are broken?
Yeah, I think it's a good point. I mean, in this case, like creating a board for your upcoming iterations, which is generally what you have to do if you're going to use iterations, is I don't know, 4 to 5 step process to create a list for every iteration and then manage that every time. I think that's certainly something that we found as we looked at this, that would be a probably easier, well, I say easier, and then every time we look at boards, it's not as easy as it seems, but it would be a potentially smaller fix to resolve that piece of the workflow, where they're not having to do that. Putting the board into, let's say, the report would also provide similar functionality, but ideally that's something where if we can do if we can make that easier in the boards, then anything else using the boards would kind of benefit from that change.
Yeah, I mean, anecdotally, every time I have to create a new board, I have to go read our docs to do it. I can't remember how to do it because the workflow for it is so very broken. And I wouldn't want to paper over that with, charts, right? Because creating a new board is relevant to so many different things that you want to do within plan. So I just really want us to keep that front of mind as we're making recommendations from a design perspective of like, how do we make this right before we add new things to it. Thank you for listening.
Well, I have the next question. I think I got 1 minute to get the answer, Nick. So in my old company, we used SAFe. So I'm familiar with the term iterations. The way we thought about it was in terms of like 2-week sprints, which maybe goes to Valerie's question a little bit. But I was kind of curious. I've seen some random feedback across the web. People like don't know the difference between what's a milestone versus like what's an iteration. Do we help differentiate the intent of a milestone versus an iteration in GitLab? Like, should they even be used in conjunction with each other? Should they only be used in isolation?
That was very confusing to me when I first started and was trying to understand these features. And it's a question I've been on a couple calls last week where we had the same question from a customer. I don't think it's as clear as it should be. I think that's probably something that we would eventually want to kind of revisit and understand, like what were the purposes of these as they were created, and like how does that purpose stand up. Generally, milestones have more integration into the product release cycle, where iterations are more of just a unstructured time box. Like it's just time and issues. But I think that generally is not clear and could be more clear for sure. And Valerie, to your question about like iterations versus sprints, I'm not sure why they're originally called iterations, but that term is used. I mean, in safe planning, they call it iterations, and then teams call it sprints. Other products call it cycles. There's probably 3 different terms between iteration, cycles, and sprints that tend to be used. But yeah, I think that's something that would be worth looking at as well.
Sorry, going back up in the agenda, that's an interesting answer, Nick, and it made me think, because this is something that confused me as I started using our new OKRs feature, which I know, by the way, I don't think you were the designer for that, but we use milestones for OKRs. But to your point, those are more closely tied to releases, and the way we use them in OKRs is not the same way that we use them in other areas of the product. And it sounds like an iteration be closer to what we mean by a milestone in an OKR. So it's just, I think, another example of like, we've got some weird stuff happening here.
Yeah, I think iterations are a little bit more clear now that we have automated cadences where you can sort of set it. So it does align more to that, like every 2 weeks we have a new one, where milestones are a bit more manually managed, but it's all a little bit unclear. And I think that's the lack of clarity comes through to our customers as well.
Awesome. Thanks, Nick. We're at time. There is one more question from Pedro in the doc if you want to answer that async. I'm going to go ahead and stop recording.